A massive thanks to Squarespace for sponsoring this video.
Welcome back to another MOTOBOB video where you join me in the studio again with this absolute stunner. It's the Indian Scout Rogue. Now this is a brand new model for 2022 and it has to be one of the best looking cruisers on the market now. But how does it go on the road? Well, in this video we'll go through all of the specs and details and I'll tell you exactly what I think of it.
Now kicking off with the engine, we've got their 1133cc liquid-cooled 60-degree V-twin. It's a relatively modern architecture that allows it to rev up nicely and make a respectable peak power of 100 horses. At the same time, it still maintains the sort of gutsy mid-range that you'd expect from a cruiser, with 98 Nm of peak torque made at 5,900 RPM. Other than that, it's pretty simple. There's a 6-speed gearbox and a traditional clutch, so no slip assist or anything like that, but for cruiser riding, one could argue you don't really need it.
Out on the road, I really like the feel of the throttle on this bike. It's nice and smooth, but also it's lively enough to give you a little bit of fun. And the engine itself has got plenty of versatility. You know, 5th and 6th gear feel pretty tall, and so when you're cruising along, it really is chugging in the low revs. But yeah, it really varies from what you might expect from a typical cruiser, because you can bang down a few gears and access that relatively revvy 100 horsepower peak. It's quick and it's fun, but it still has that cruisery nature in the low revs, and so for me, the engine is a massive standout point.
And not only does it provide the forward propulsion, but like many other modern motorcycles, it's also accountable for a large part of the chassis structure. You can see from these images that there's a large aluminium front frame that reaches down and houses the radiator. There's a small section of tubular frame along the top, and then a subframe and side plates, again made from aluminium and bolted to the back of the engine. Now, not only does a design like this help to keep the weight down and increase rigidity, but also Indian intended it to be modular so that different subframes, for example, can be bolted on for different styles of bike. The whole lot is suspended on a 41mm right way up non-adjustable fork, and that gets 120mm of travel, whereas the preload adjustable twin shocks at the rear get just 51. Up front, there's a single 2-piston brake caliper on a 298mm disc. Unfortunately, you also get a 298mm disc at the rear, which is relatively large and so adds a bit of extra stopping power, albeit with a single pot caliper. Now, one of the major changes for the Rogue is that front wheel with a bigger 19-incher as opposed to the 16 inches of the Scout and Scout Bobber. On top of that, you get a slimmer tyre in the form of some METZELER CRUISETECs, and although they're cruiser specific and built for heavy loads, they're certainly more sporty looking than the Pirelli MT60s on the Scout Bobber.
For me, this bike mainly biases towards that sort of classic cruiser handling. It's long, it's low, it's stable, it's relatively modest on the front brake, so it definitely needs a little bit of rear brake as well to haul it up quickly. But I will say it feels that little bit sharper than something like the Scout Bobber. That new front wheel size with this tyre choice just makes it feel that little bit more sharp on the turn-in. The big balloon tyres like you get on the Scout Bobber or the Triumph Bobber, you know, they're never going to feel that precise. But this, when you counter steer, it just tips in and flicks in that little bit quicker. And so out of the two, the Scout Bobber and this, there's just that little bit more of a sporty feeling.
Another change for the Rogue is that it gets a different cockpit than the other models in the Scout lineup, so mini 8 bars and a retro-styled fairing as standard. Now, the fairing does keep a little bit of wind off your torso, but really it's mainly for looks, and so don't expect it to give you coverage like a Roadmaster. The higher bar position will feel good for some riders though, especially as the seat is so low, so the bars are very high in relation. 649mm is about as low as it gets, and so it should make the bike super accessible to almost any rider. Personally, I actually got on pretty well with this riding position. Usually, I prefer mid-position foot controls and lower bars, but I did like the super laid-back ergonomics on this bike for easy riding. riding. Plus, you can always delve into the accessories catalogue if you do wish to mix it up, and while you're there, it might be worth checking out some of the options for upgrading the rear shocks.
These standard shocks are a little bit firm and there isn't a great deal of travel, so I think there's some shocks from Fox and also some fully adjustable piggyback Indian branded shocks, and yeah, I might just be looking at those to give it a little more cushiness at the rear end, because on rough roads you can feel the road surface and harsh bumps beneath you. All in though, it's not really pretending to be a big, cushy, comfy tourer, and so if you like this sort of laid back, typical commanding cruiser position, then it certainly delivers on that.
Now this section might be a little bit brief because a spaceship this is not. There are no riding modes and no rider aids apart from the mandatory ABS. There's no TFT dash, just a simple single analog speedo with a small digital readout. And there's even no fuel gauge, just a warning light. But I'm not sure a bike of this nature really needs lots of gadgets and gizmos.
For me, a sort of stripped back, minimal riding experience really suits this style and image of bike. Personally, I'm happy to do without loads of riding modes and settings and all that kind of thing. There are just two things that I do like if I'm putting in decent miles. One of them is navigation capabilities, and I've fitted my Beeline Moto. They're a channel sponsor, but it does suit this bike styling really nicely with the round mirrors, round clock, round headlights. And then the other thing I'd like to have is cruise control, and unfortunately this bike doesn't get it. Now it is a bit of a shame because the base model FTRs, which are super similar in price to this bike, it gets a similar simple dash as well. You know, those bikes, they get cruise control as standard. But look, it's not for everybody, that's a personal preference, and if you can live without it, then I think, like I say, the simplicity just suits the bike. Now, like I said at the beginning of this video, I think this is one of the best looking cruisers on the market. Quite often with this genre of bike, you're thinking, well, what would I change if I bought one? You know, customization is a big part of cruiser ownership. But for me, the finish is so clean on this bike and the choice of color is perfect. I love the finish on the saddle, in the cockpit. And so really, I think I'd just go for a tail tidy and then some slimmer, louder pipes. And I think that's all it needs really. Like I always say though, looks are subjective. So let me know what you think of it down in the comments below. And if you don't think this is the best looking cruiser on the market, then let me know what is.
In terms of price, the Rogue sits above the entry-level Scout and Scout Bobber, and you can see why with a little bit of extra pizzazz to the looks. It also looks about right versus what I'd now say is the closest competition, the Harley Nightster. Each bike has its strengths versus the other, and so I've got a more comprehensive head-to-head video coming out soon. The other option would be the Triumph Bobber, which does come in a little cheaper here in the UK, although a lot of my audience is in the US, where actually the Rogue undercuts the Bobber by a pretty massive margin that makes it a bit of a no-brainer.
For me, this is just the exact sort of cruiser that I would like to own. The engine's brilliant and it's got enough there to nail it in a straight line and put a big smile on your face, and it doesn't run out of steam as you climb through the revs. I like the feel of the throttle, it handles pretty nicely, certainly a little bit sharper than the Bobber. It's got that classic cruiser riding position and a beautiful aesthetic to it too. A little bit of an upgrade on the shocks and then some louder pipes, a tail tidy, and for me this would be a cracking bike. And I also like the fact that you don't see absolutely loads of them on the road. But as always, I'd love to know what you think of it down in the comments below. And if you're new here and you want to see more videos like this, then hit subscribe and I'll catch you in the next one.
Now before I leave you, I need to tell you again about today's sponsor, and that's Squarespace. It's a super easy place to make a website with absolutely loads of beautiful looking templates to choose from. But beneath the surface, there's much more to it. You can grow a whole community with their powerful features for creating gated members only content, as well as email communications and useful audience insight. You can also start a blog with full threaded comments for your audience. You can automatically cross-post from your social media profiles, and there are loads of third-party extensions to help with starting an online store, like inventory management, global shipping, and more. So simply head to squarespace.com for a free trial, and then when you're ready to launch, go to squarespace.com/motobob, and you'll save 10% off your first purchase of a website or domain.